Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk featuring Curtis Sittenfeld and Roxane Gay for a discussion about Curtis's latest novel, Rodham. I'm Kate Whitman, Vice President of Author Programs and Community Engagement for the Atlanta History Center, and I'm beyond thrilled to be bringing this event into your home tonight. You can purchase copies of both Rodham and Roxane's most recent book, Hunger, directly from our official bookseller, Acapella Books. There is a link to both books in the chat feature, so check that out. As Roxane and Curtis are talking, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and Roxane will get to as many of them as time allows. And now to introduce our authors. Curtis Sittenfeld is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels Prep, The Man of My Dreams, American Wife, Sisterland, and Eligible, as well as the story collection You Think It, I'll Say It, which has been translated into 30 languages. Her short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, The Washington Post Magazine, Esquire, and the Best American Short Stories, of which she was the 2020 guest editor. Her nonfiction has appeared in The New York Times, The Atlantic, Time, and Vanity Fair, and on public radio's This American Life. Roxane Gay's writing appears in Best American Mystery Stories 2014, Best American Short Stories 2012, Best Sex Writing 2012, A Public Space, McSweeney's, Tin House, Oxford American, American Short Fiction, Virginia Quarterly Review, and many others. She's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. She's the author of many books, including the New York Times bestselling Bad Feminist, the nationally bestselling Difficult Women, and the New York Times bestselling Hunger. She's the author of World of Wakanda for Marvel, and she has several books forthcoming and is also at work on television and film projects. Thank you both for being here. And Roxane, I'll hand it over to you now.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here, and it's great to be talking to Curtis about her latest novel, Rodham. So, Curtis, what is it like promoting a book during a pandemic?
Oh my goodness. Well, okay, the first thing I have to say, thank you, Kate, and the Atlanta History Center, and also Roxane, thank you so much. I know that you're a very busy person, producing lots of writing for many places, and so this is such an act of generosity on your part, and I really appreciate it. So it's very weird, I think, to have a book come out during a pandemic, and I almost feel like I won't know what happened for like maybe 2 years or 4 years, because it's so, I don't know if you feel this way with your books, but every book, its life and its publication are kind of different because of like the topic of the book, you know, what's going on in the world, what's going on in my life, and because everything is so sort of extreme right now, it's just really hard to know. And I mean, this is like, I feel proud of this book, and it's kind of a weird book, so it's also hard to know, like so I will say a lot of people have said, I cried at the end, and I think, well, did you cry because of the book, or did you cry because there's like a lot of reasons to cry right now?
So why is this a weird book?
Well, I mean, you can tell me if you agree or disagree, but it's, so the premise is, you know, in real life, Bill Clinton proposed twice and Hillary declined, and then he proposed a third time and she accepted. And the premise of the novel is, what if she had declined the third time and gone her own way? And so there's definitely this mixing of fact and fiction and, you know, history and my imagination, and that I think, you know, because Hillary is obviously this incredibly public figure, and then, you know, it's like imagining her like brushing her teeth at night, or, which I'm being euphemistic by saying brushing her teeth. So I think that in that way, like, again, I don't ever think a weird book is a bad thing, but I do think it's kind of a weird book. Do you think it's a weird book?
You know, I think it's a surreal book because Donald Trump's presidency has been such a disaster. I think that a lot of us have spent a lot of time wondering what could have been if the world were a different place. And, you know, one of the interesting things about alternate history, and that's certainly what you've done here, is that you give voice to at least one alternative that could have been. And so, you know, it's a little surreal given everything that's going on and given how disastrous the Trump presidency has been, to imagine Hillary Clinton's life if she had not married Bill Clinton. And so, yeah, it's, I think, surreal more than strange to me. So you wrote about a real person, well, several real people, actually. What kinds of research did you do to make a believable portrayal of someone who's actually alive and well?
So I had, when I wrote my novel American Wife, which is a fictional retelling of the life of Laura Bush, but changes names, which Rodham for the most part doesn't, or with the most public figures it doesn't. But when I wrote American Wife as research, I read Hillary's memoir, Living History, which I think it came out maybe in 2003, and I read it in 2007. So even before I started writing this book in 2017, I had some sort of, you know, general framework or overview of her life. Of course, I read What Happened. I read the first 240 pages of Bill's 1,000-page memoir up to the point they get married. And it was actually very juicy and colorful. And I sort of stopped reading because the rest of it wasn't my focus. It wasn't like I was, you know, like if I had an infinite amount of time, I would have read the other 760 pages. I read memoirs by the female senators who ran for president in this past cycle: Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand. And then I read sort of other random, like Chasing Hillary by the New York Times journalist Amy Chozick. There's a Carl Bernstein biography of Hillary called A Woman in Charge. And I certainly read lots of articles and went down rabbit holes that, you know, I didn't necessarily know existed from the outset. But mostly I did. You know, I wouldn't say I read, I'm trying to think if I read any other fiction. I could have, but like for the purposes of this book, I think it was mostly nonfiction.
So for people who may not be familiar, you wrote An American Wife, which is a sort of not an alternate history, but a retelling of Laura Bush's life. And I actually have read American Wife and I loved it. And I thought, oh, this is so interesting, and it humanized someone not necessarily her, because I always have found her to be relatively human, but it certainly humanized her husband, who I do not consider human. And so I'm curious, what have you learned between writing American Wife, in which it's set in the history we know, and Rodham, which creates an alternative history?
You know, it's an interesting question that in some ways I find like I'm so close to the material still that I kind of find it difficult to answer. Like, I mean, I think it was a strange thing for me to write this book. So to write Rodham. So I started it in spring 2017, and it took me about 2.5 years. And I showed almost none of it to anybody until hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages existed. And so it felt like, I think in some ways I didn't realize, like some people have said to me like, oh, the book is like wild, or it blew my mind. And what they are referring to, I think, is this blurring of fact and fiction, and sort of using historical moments that those of us who are in our 40s might remember from real life, or from, you know, high school or college or something. And so I do think that, I think it was more challenging to write Rodham than to write American Wife. I mean, maybe I only think this because I wrote it more recently, but it felt more challenging because it was almost like I could change things. I could change things from the historical record, and I did change many. But when I was referring to things that were historical events, I either felt like I needed to get them right or have a reason for changing them, and sort of change them in kind of clear ways. And so I felt there were times when I felt almost like my own magazine fact checker as I wrote Rodham. But of course, I mean, as I'm sure you experience, like you don't want the reader to ever know whether writing something in particular was like a grind for you. Like you wanted to read as if it was all like an effortless delight to write.
So many things are an effortless delight. So you said that you wanted to always have a good reason when you changed history as we know it. What other rules did you have for yourself, particularly when it comes to writing about real people?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, it comes up when I end up talking about my book, and especially talking about American Wife and then talking about Rodham, like people say to me, oh, would you ever write a book about Melania or from the perspective of Melania? And the answer is, I definitely would not. Like, I'm not interested in it, but I wouldn't, because I don't feel like compassion for her. I don't admire her. And I know, even though this is not provable, I know that like I essentially admire and respect Laura Bush. I don't think she's perfect by any means. I admire and respect Hillary. I also don't think she's perfect. And so like I know that I'm not sort of embarking on the project trying to mock or humiliate someone. And I feel like that to me is almost like the most important ground rule. And then in some ways after that, it's almost like I have to just go for it, or else why bother to write the book? Like I can't, I mean, like some people have said to me, again, like, do you think she'll read it, or she has read it? And I don't think that she has. I don't think that she will. And I don't think I wrote it for her as the intended audience, even though I do admire her. But I think I had to write a novel and not like a message from Curtis to Hillary, like, because it's just like those are two different things. And it probably a message to Hillary from Curtis would be like a fan letter, which I can imagine writing, but I don't think almost anyone would want to read it besides maybe my mom.
So one of the challenges I think in dealing with real people's lives is that you have to deal with their actual imperfections. And when you think of Hillary Clinton, I think one of the things that came up a lot when she was running for president in 2016 was her husband, who seemed to be this sort of albatross around her neck. And so did you worry about having to grapple with Bill Clinton and the allegations against him with regards to sexual assault and just his general sleaziness?
Well, I mean, yes. Like one of the things that I think is interesting and depressing that I think that people felt like in 2016, obviously Trump has this terrible history with regard to women, but I think a lot of people felt like it was hard for Hillary to attack him on that, because he would then counterattack her by bringing up her husband. And so I think that was one of the things that made me think, well, okay, what if she wasn't responsible for Bill and for herself? What if she was only responsible for herself? And I think that was one of the sort of motives for the entire book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So are you happy with how the book turned out?
Do people, just out of curiosity, do people ask you that, or do you ask yourself that about your own books?
People do ask me that, and I always ask myself that too, like not immediately after writing a book, but when I've had a few months or years, I sort of look back and ask myself, am I happy with what I did there? And, it's always interesting to think about that, because writers are, we tend to be our own worst critics.
Yeah.
And so many of us tend to never be happy with what we've written. But I'm not that writer. I look back at my work. I'm like, okay, that was pretty good for what you sure, given everything. That was not bad. And so I'm curious, were you happy with what you did with the book and where you took Hillary's story?
I am happy with the book. I mean, I think it's an interesting, like the experience of publication is interesting, where like sometimes people give you feedback and it's almost like they're telling you like the book they wish you had written, or maybe like the book they would have written if someone had said like, this is the premise. But I do feel that I am like proud and satisfied with this book, and that I think sometimes the question that I ask myself, especially as I'm like getting toward finishing a book or revising it, is, would I enjoy this if it were by someone else? And the weird thing about my own books is that I do think they have kind of, again, maybe surreal premises, or like, I think they have weird premises, or they sound kind of weird. And so I can understand, like I might be like, a fictional retelling of the life of Laura Bush, like who would want to read that? But I think that if I opened it and were like reading the sentences and turning the pages, I think that I would find it interesting.
So over the years, you have written, I think, across a range of not necessarily genres, but definitely tones, from prep to You Think It, I'll Say It, American Wife, Sisterland, Eligible, and now Rodham. How do you determine sort of where you want to take your literary voice next?
Well, okay, I'm going to answer this, and then I actually am much more interested in your answer to this question, because I think you do write much more across genres than I do. Like I write a pinch of nonfiction, like an essay, a few essays a year, and then I write fiction. And actually, the older I get, I think we're pretty close in age. The
Yes.
older I get, the more I feel like my fiction muscle is like strong, and all my other muscles have atrophied, and like I don't know. So but I mean, in terms of a topic for a book, I feel like usually what happens is I have an idea and I feel sort of consumed by it, or I think like, that would be super interesting, and like I could spend 2 years thinking about that, or 3 years, and like there's so many ways to kind of approach it, and so it's like it feels too big for a short story. Like a short story feels like a moment, but this, a novel feels like there's like just so many elements of this, but it is so it's not, I don't think there's any particular rule, and then I think the tone sort of comes out of the subject. But how do you decide what your next project is? And I assume you're actually working across forms simultaneously, like maybe not in the same day, but in the same, I don't know. How do you answer that question?
It's not so. It's not really as formal a thing as you would think. I just like telling stories, and so I am agnostic in terms of the container that story will appear in. And I also enjoy the challenge of learning the rules of new genres and applying what I know about storytelling to that genre. The only genre I don't write in is poetry. I'm just a terrible poet. And
Try.
I'm just so bad at it. I'm so bad at it. And like when I look back at the little poems I wrote in my late teens and early 20s, like one of them was called Tears, just to give you like I'm not being humble. I'm just bad at it. So, mostly it's just, I'm always interested in trying new things. And, early on in my career, I was really concerned with being pigeonholed and only being allowed to write certain kinds of stories, especially as a Black woman. And so I just told myself I was going to do something different from one project to the next, so that like I would never be pigeonholed. And then it just became something enjoyable, and not only a stubborn response to racism. So, now I just enjoy surprising people. Like, you never know where I'm going to turn up next.
That's very true. Do you feel like there's like a form or a genre that's like closest to your heart at this point?
Well, my first love it's fiction.
Yeah.
And most people don't know me as a fiction writer, which is sad, but that's okay because I know me as a fiction writer, and I think of myself as a fiction writer. So it's, I would say, fiction, and especially short fiction, but I also enjoy writing novels.
Well, if we run out of things to talk about with Rodham, we also can talk about that I am the guest editor of the Best American Short Stories for 2020, which you were 2 years ago. So I don't know how much other people want to hear us talk about that, but I would be delighted to chat.
Oh my God, that's actually interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
So for people who may not know, every year there's a new editor for the Best American and insert genre, but especially short stories. And I found it to be a really fun job.
Same.
And you get to read like 120 short stories. And it's not necessarily hard to weed it down to like 40, but going from 40 to the 20 you get to put into the anthology is very, very hard. So how did you enjoy the experience of editing BASS?
I felt exactly the way you feel. So the series editor is a woman named Heidi Pittler, and then the guest editor changes, and Heidi essentially curates, or like the 120 stories, although I think we as the guest editors could say like, oh, there's this story that's not in the packet that you sent me that I want to consider. But I felt exactly the way that you felt, that narrowing, I think I could narrow it from like maybe 120 to 60, but then I did feel like, oh my God, there's a lot of like really, really great stories out there and a lot of really great writers. And I think it is, for me, it was a really exciting feeling. Like in some ways it makes me feel old and out of it. And then in other ways it's exciting to be like, I've never heard of this writer. And in some cases I've never heard of this publication. And like, this is amazing. Like I feel like one of the reasons that I love fiction is that it does feel like there's always something new. There's always new voices. And especially sometimes people who are early in their career, although that's not a requirement for the stories, but there is this like energy in their work that's sort of exciting. And I read those, like I read the anthology from the time I was a teenager. Like, did you read it from your?
I was maybe 14 or 15. I would read the anthology and just dream. And just, it was never a goal that felt realistic to me. It was never even something I aspired to. It was just like, that's like where the fancy writers are. And then in 2012, I had a story selected by Tom Perrotta.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's a really great guy and who's very, very generous as a writer. And he selected my story and my friend Mike McGinnis's story from Hobart, a magazine that nobody's heard of. And it let me realize that, people love to complain about these sort of anthologies and these institutions and say that it's only the New Yorker and the Paris Review. And there are a lot of stories from the New Yorker, as I'm sure you noticed.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of stories from a lot of other publications as well. And I think I only had 3 stories from the New Yorker make it into my final sort of iteration. Not that they weren't good, but there was just an abundance of great work.
Yeah. No, I felt, by the way, as you might remember, you chose a story of mine for your year, which I think I thanked you on Twitter, but also thank you now. That was a lovely, I felt very honored by that.
You're welcome. It was such a pleasure to read that story because there was just like that little turn where it just surprised me, and I'm so rarely surprised. And so I enjoyed having that, which actually has me thinking, how do you bring about moments of surprise in your writing, whether it's in Rodham or in other work? Because I think so many readers crave being surprised, crave feeling that moment of engagement where a story goes where you don't think it's going to go. And so how do you create those moments?
Well, so I think you're right that like I love as a reader being surprised, but the interesting thing is I want to feel sort of authentically surprised, or as if it's surprising but it's also plausible, instead of like it's surprising but it's unrealistic. And so weirdly, I think I would say that I try to set up for, like, if there's a surprise coming in my fiction, I probably, in this really like plodding way, set up for like 50 pages before or 20 pages before, or like it's like that's probably the stuff that I like worked on the most, to try to, because I mean I feel like as a reader I want to be tricked a little bit, you know, like I don't want to be manipulated, but I want the writer to be one step ahead of me. Like the worst feeling is if I feel like I'm one step ahead of the writer and I'm like, this is not going to go well for you, this is not going to turn out. So it's like yeah, like kind of saying, you know, you thought this was going one way, but maybe it was going another. And I think actually Rodham, like, so when I was in graduate school, one of the professors would say that, you know, fiction is this conversation between the reader and the writer. And I think of that all the time. And I feel like when I'm writing about familiar subject matter, like familiar to the reader, like Hillary Clinton, or like, you know, I wrote this modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice, it's sort of, I sort of have to acknowledge within the text, like you, the reader, have some familiarity with this story, and I have to defy some of your expectations to make it interesting, but I have to kind of probably fulfill some of your expectations to like give you pleasure and like sort of give you some of what you came to the story for.
You know, it was interesting. I have also read Eligible, and I enjoyed it for a lot of reasons, but I'm always into contemporary retellings of classic narratives. And it was set in Ohio, which, you know, when you think of Pride and Prejudice, you think of the bucolic English countryside, and then, oh, no, Cleveland. And so do you think you'll ever do another novel like Eligible, where you are doing a retelling of a classic? And did you enjoy writing something like Eligible?
So it's funny because I think in some ways, even though people who have read more than one of my books, they might say like, oh, American Wife and, you know, Rodham are kind of like counterparts. But actually, I think that Eligible is as much a counterpart, or like it's sort of my borrowing this existing architecture, external architecture, or borrowing might be like the euphemism. So I think it makes me, I mean, maybe this is what you're saying about working in different genres. It makes me use my brain in a different way to kind of take a plot that already exists. And I think it's challenging and interesting. And especially with writing Eligible, I felt very conscious. Like, I think, you know, like many writers, I can be like a little bit dark or like cynical about human nature. And I felt very conscious of like the pleasure of writing toward a happy ending in Eligible. And it was almost like that happy ending had been given to me by Jane Austen, like, because I'm not that good at giving it to myself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, do you think that you would ever dip into that? Like, is there any classic that you want to?
Oh, I would. I definitely would. I don't know what classic novel I would take on, but if the opportunity ever presented itself, you know, especially, you know, some of the women authors from the 1800s and the 1900s, like I would love to do a retelling of an Edith Wharton novel. Edith Wharton is my favorite writer.
Really?
And, yeah, she's just phenomenal. I love everything she does. And she also has a really great book on how to write fiction. But anyway,
Really? I didn't know
it's not well known because people only ever talk about men writing craft books, but she has a really good book, and I think it's just called The Writing Fiction. And I have a PDF of it somewhere because it's, of course, from like nearly 100 years ago, and it's very, very good. And she's just like so witty and wry and just like, oh, I can't even tell you how caustic she can be. But also she gives really great writing advice. And I use it when I'm teaching my own students. And they're like, wait, who's Edith Wharton? And I'm just like, oh, of course. But it's okay. It's okay because I help them come to the light about Edith. But I would definitely do something like that. I think it would be awesome to do something like, yeah, I would start with Edith Wharton, because the other writer I would love to do it for, but I would never, is Toni Morrison. I'm just not good enough to even approach that. But like,
I think you're good. No, let me be the first to say, I think you can do whatever you want. I mean, it's funny because I feel like I would feel like weirdly, even though I wrote Rodham and Hillary is Alive, I think I would feel weird like rewriting the novel, of which obviously Toni Morrison is not alive, but of a living, or even like almost like someone who I had overlapped in their lifetime or something. I don't know. It would be sort of, I feel like there's a few other classic stories that I kind of feel like there's one where I'm like, oh, could I do that as a short story? Like sometimes there's things which I think in my own head I need more clarity, where like almost like if it's a short story, write it as a short story. Like don't unnecessarily write 400 pages.
Which is always the trick, like knowing when to go short and when to go long.
Yeah.
So what do you, this is a challenging question as a writer to receive. I get asked it all the time. What are you working on now? If you're comfortable talking about it. Sometimes I'm just like, I'm not working on anything but waking up every day.
Well, do you mean like, I mean, I guess like, do you mean challenging in the sense of like, because of everything going on in the world, or?
No. I mean, the world is always going to be complicated. More like challenging in that sometimes it's nebulous. Sometimes you don't, like some writers are very superstitious. I'm not superstitious. I'm just a procrastinator. And so I'm always hesitant to talk about it, because then like a year later, people are like, so where's that project you were talking about? And I'm like, where I left it.
I mean, I would say, so I feel sometimes superstitious talking about specific ideas, because I feel like, not that I think someone would take the idea, but I think sometimes when I describe it, it sounds like not a good idea. And I feel like it sort of undermines my own confidence in the project. So I will say, I'm like, writing a short story right now. And I did have to think to myself, like, okay, what year is this set? Because I think that even if like, say, the presidency is never mentioned, or like you almost have to think like, is that the cloud that the characters are, like, is it post 2016 that the characters are living under? Or certainly, like, I have not written any pandemic fiction. I'm sure that it's a matter of time before I do. So sorry, everyone. So I'm like writing a short story. I have this idea, like I feel, like after writing Rodham, which was research intensive and, kind of took me a while. Like I have this idea of like, oh, I want to write like a really fun, fizzy 200-page novel, but I just like, I don't know if that exists inside me. Like it might be, I don't know. I might have to write like 3 short stories, and like that's the closest I can get to a fizzy 200-page novel.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions from the audience. So this is a good question, and it's not only for Rodham, but it can apply especially, I think, Rodham, because Rodham is very plot heavy and there's an entire timeline. Are you someone who outlines and plots out a novel, or do you just let the words take you where they will?
I definitely outline and plot out. Like, so sometimes, the novel has 7 chapters, and I probably, like, I kind of take each of them on its own and think of like the plot within that section or that chapter. Like I don't, and then there's supposed to be sort of like echoes across the decades and across the chapters. But I always, like, sometimes I start writing and I of course think that I've started at the beginning, and then I realize I've started in like the 4th scene or something. And so I end up revising my outlines weirdly, even though like no one sees them besides me. And sometimes they get so messy, I have to like, I type them and then I have to retype them. But I for myself, I like I feel like I wouldn't be able to. I even outline like short stories. Do you outline?
Fortunately, I hope none of my students are watching this. 8 times out of 10, no, I do not outline. I just go where the piece takes me. I am outlining a couple upcoming projects. I outlined my next book that's coming, well, sort of my next book that's coming out next year. It's a book of writing advice, and I wanted to make sure that I covered everything that I want to cover and that I don't repeat myself and so on.
Yeah.
And so I did outline that one, and I'm actually, like you, revising that outline because as I get into the writing, I am finding like, oh, okay, I have to say more about this one thing and less about this other thing. So it is turning out useful, but for the most part, I am not a big outliner.
I feel like for me, my own outlines almost function like a private table of contents. Like sometimes if I have 300 pages, I almost feel like I can't find things, or I need to be able to like see it all or something. Like it's almost like having a map for me, I think. But
yeah, and that's what I tell my students. And it's good to have a map because you want to know where you're going and how you plan on getting there. And the great thing about maps is that sometimes you can go off road, but it is useful. Yeah.
although, but I certainly I don't think that outlines are like inherently virtuous. Like I think they're useful, but I don't think it's like, wrong not to.
Yeah. I think that they're one of the things that a lot of sort of writing purists live and die by. And there are two things that people do that with: outlining and what's the other thing they do it with? Oh, revision. And like, oh man, people just love to sort of worship at the altar of revision, which is incredibly important. But like, it is disproportionately important to a lot of writers. And they're like, I revised this 44 times. And I'm like, that's 43 times too many.
Okay, I have two things to say about that. One, I always wonder when someone's like, this went through 44 drafts. I'm like, do you mean when you like removed a comma? Like, is that a draft to you? Because I do not, I literally think that it doesn't mean like draft. It doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And I do think that there can be a phenomenon of like, which I think I've seen very talented writers do this, where a person, like, it's almost like, a person has written a short story and it's like 85% great. And then the person changes it almost like completely and it's 85% great. And it's almost like, just go on to something else, it's all going to be imperfect or like, yeah.
I think so many writers have perfection as the goal, and I just have excellence as a goal, not perfection, because perfection is not a thing that's achievable, at least.
By the way, I feel like you should have like pillows made that say like, I don't have like.
That's a good idea. Just like some little,
I think there could be a market for that.
Whenever a writer is frustrated with a draft, they can just scream into a motivational pillow. I really like where your head's at. So this is a question about some of the choices you made with Rodham. You have at the end of the novel, well, spoiler alert, but Hillary Clinton ends up running against Carol Moseley Brown. So why did you choose her as the competition, and what kinds of things were you trying to do there?
So, I mean, I think this is sort of like the middle of the book. So I feel like it's not, it's a little spoilery, but I feel like it's fine for us to talk about. So in the book, as in real life, Hillary and Bill fall in love at Yale Law School. Hillary follows Bill back to Arkansas in the early 70s. And then they got married in real life in 1975. And in my version, I think in October 75, and in my version, spoiler, she drives away in like June 1975. And so I had to think about like, what would her life be like? Which the weird thing is that, like, I'm not, like, if you said to me, what do you sincerely think her life would have been like if she hadn't married Bill? That's actually a different answer than Rodham, because again, Rodham is a novel. It's supposed to be a story, and it's supposed to be interesting and entertaining, and again have this relationship to reality. And like, if she had in real life, I think she might have, like, say, gotten married and had several children and been like a very successful trailblazing lawyer, like in, a Midwestern city or something. But that would not necessarily be a novel about Hillary, let alone about Hillary and Bill and blah, blah, blah. So I sort of thought to myself, in terms of the plot, like, where do I take her? And in real life, she'd worked on the, like, Watergate impeachment inquiry. And so it was like, she could go back to DC, she could go to maybe back to New Haven, and I chose to have her go back to, she grew up in Chicago, a suburb of Chicago. And she does ultimately run against Carol Moseley Braun in the 1992 senatorial election. And I feel like, I thought it was an interesting way to sort of explore, particularly, I think that a lot of white feminists can have a blind spot about race. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to sort of explore, like, that tension and those failings, and especially, I certainly didn't anticipate the world that my book, and I was going to say, I didn't anticipate the world my book would be published into, but in a way, this world has existed all along. So I think I probably did. And I didn't know that things would be so heightened now, I guess, in terms of, like, protests. But these tensions have existed not only, like in the last several years. It's going back like 200 years. So I think it was, I would say, primarily that plot line was a way to try to explore that, like, the sort of failures of white feminism. And then also, as I was saying, that the professor who would say, fiction is this conversation between the reader and the writer, that, like, I suppose not every reader, but a lot of readers know the true outcome of that election. And so if Hillary makes a comment about, like, Carol Moseley Braun's electability, the reader has knowledge that the character, like the fictional Hillary, doesn't.
Yes. So let's see. Someone asked about what's on our bookshelves.
By the way, I have to say, I was like, this might sound fawning, but your bookshelves are beautiful, like,
This is like the virtual background.
Wait, it's fake?
It's totally fake.
Oh my God.
Real. This is real. This is my library, and my library is in a different room. So this is my real book collection. Or part of it. You're missing part of it. So, like, my wife is a graphic designer, an artist, and so she photoshopped the shelves here out and put in a window.
Oh, that's how, you know what, I feel like that's the success, or like the sign of, like, a, good life, is that when your fake background is, like, from your own house. And,
yeah,
like,
it is.
That's very aspirational.
It is. This is the first house I've ever bought because I didn't have any family help, and so I had to wait many, many years. And so before I moved in, I had shelves built from floor to ceiling, and at some point I want to install one of those little rolling ladders.
Oh
but
my God.
I like my books, and I don't like to give them away. And so I have a range of books on my shelves right now. And there are actual books behind me because I'm in my home office, and right now it's just a bunch of galleys. And
that's so funny. So even if that's not the bookshelf behind you, those are really beautiful bookshelves. Okay, sorry, what were we just talking about? Oh, someone asked us about. Oh, so in all honesty, like, one of the things that virtual book tour has made me realize is that my house is super messy. I think I knew it, but it's actually a little bit challenging to find uncluttered space with natural light, which I've been told is important after not using it in a few instances. And so these are some, it's sort of a random assortment of books. Like, some are Hillary-ish, and then some I just like pulled off the nearest. I mean, I think I probably. I mean, I think in all honesty, I haven't read all of them, but then some of them I love. We could go book by book. I mean, a lot of Hillary research books are here.
Awesome. Do you miss touring?
Do I what?
Do you miss touring?
Oh, it's funny. I guess I miss like I don't like I think that sometimes it's interesting and I feel like there are questions that you've asked me like especially about like the surprises or whatever that I have not been asked before, but sometimes it's like sometimes when I hear myself answering questions I'm like I know what I think of that, like I'm not super interested, but the thing I like is that there are these kind of like funny or special moments that I feel like happen in every public event. Like I think it was in 2018 I read at this at the library in Philadelphia, and these 4 sisters came up to me and they said, whenever you have a book come out, we buy 1 copy and we pass it around to each of us. And they had a copy of Prep with like, and like I think the cover was like almost falling off. And it was so like they were all there, all 4 of them, like we took our picture. And I also know, because this would happen to me with American Wife, like somebody would come up and say like, I knew Laura Bush in 1987, and like here's a little tidbit, and like I love little tidbits, and so I feel like I know that somebody would tell me like little, and it would probably be like sweet stories about, or like I was Hillary's intern in 1994 or something. So I miss, or like when I was on tour for Eligible, like this lovely probably 75-year-old woman in Milwaukee gave me a pin that said "I heart Darcy," which of course I still have. So it's, I mean, so I think it's like, yeah, I do miss those like sweet little human interactions. I don't. What are your feelings? I mean, you tour a lot. Like
I tour a lot. This is the longest I've been. After 2 weeks, it was the longest I had been home in one go since 2014.
Oh my
God.
And do you like it, or are you in withdrawal?
Well, part of it is that it's how I make my living.
Yeah.
For the most part, people think it's teaching, but teaching doesn't pay a lot, guys. I hate to break it to you, but it does give me health insurance, which is why I do it. Other than the fact that I love it.
Wait, are you currently teaching, or like will you?
I'm taking the year off.
Okay.
So I am fortunately not teaching presently.
Yeah.
And it's great too. I must admit, it's been great to just write full time, or at least think full time, and hopefully be ready to write. But I like touring. There are things I don't like about it, but I've also been really lucky. I have not had any of the disastrous experiences that so many writers complain about. I've always had just really great events and a lot of publisher support for touring. And so it's very easy for me to say I like it. And I agree, there's always something magical that happens in person. And I meet so many readers who are so enthusiastic and have such interesting stories, and sometimes painful stories, but I'm honored that they trust me with them. So, I do miss that part, but I'm also enjoying just not traveling and not sitting in a lot of gross green rooms, and like, yeah, this is good.
With your bookshelves.
Yes. Oh, I love communing with my books. In fact, today we're installing a tiny library in front of the house.
Oh, like a little.
Yeah. And I'm going to put galleys in there, and it's pink. Oh, I'm so excited.
Wait, are you putting like not your own galleys, but like other people's?
Other people's, for sure. And like, I just have so many books, and I give them away. I used to mail them to people. I would just give them away on the internet, on Twitter, and then I would mail them. But then it got to a point where it was not safe to give out my home address, and you have to put a return address. Yeah. And so then I stopped, and my assistant would take them to the library. And so I still do some of that, but now I'm going to like give them away to my neighbors.
By the way, so I live in Minneapolis. The founder or creator of the Little Free Libraries was from here and
Oh,
actually died recently. But I would say there's the highest number of those libraries of any that I've like ever seen here. So, which is sort of fascinating. And I always like it's always like you feel like it's sort of revealing of the inhabitants of the house that it's next to or something, like what books they're giving away.
yes, like what they prioritize, what do they read, and yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see if people take the books in. Okay, so and this is a question I have two. Two questions I'm gonna push into one. One of them is mine, and one of them is from an audience member. How much of what you write about the earlier years between Bill and Hillary is accurate and true to life? And also, there's a lot of sex in the early part of the book. Uh, so how do you feel about writing sex? Because some writers hate it, some writers lean into it and are like, yes, this is the good stuff. And so what are your feelings on writing sex?
Well, okay, so actually those questions in some ways are sort of linked, where like definitely the sex is made up. Like I wasn't there. Like the sections that take place in Yale Law School or in Arkansas, I tried to do research and use details that are like part of the historical record. And there's a first date, like Hillary and Bill, it's true. So these are a few things that are sort of like they talk about in their own memoirs, that I think the first time they ever encountered each other, she heard him talking about watermelon in the law library. And I think sort of thought, like, who's that noisy person with a Southern accent? And then several months later, they saw each other they were in this, I think the law student lounge. And then they saw each other in the library, and sort of he was like staring at her. And as they continued to make eye contact, she basically went up and said, like, I'm Hillary Rodham. If you're looking at me, we might as well meet each other. And then they went on this date where the gallery in New Haven was closed, and but they like made an agreement with a security guard that if they picked up litter outside of it, they would be allowed to see some of the art. And then they went and sat in the courtyard. So all of that it's almost like the kind of public actions are based in real stories that they've told or that have been written about in books about them. But of course, the dialogue is like 95% made up. And certainly like any physical gesture, or like in Hillary's memoir, I think she spends like maybe a few pages on meeting and falling in love with Bill, and I spend like maybe 100 pages on her meeting and falling in love. Like it was very important to me, almost like with a romantic comedy. You have to feel invested in the couple in the beginning in order to care what happens to them, including caring if they break up. And so I really like the sort of physical attraction and the chemistry and like the dialogue, and was all very important to me. And I think that sex is part of that. Like I feel like if there weren't any sex in the book, like I think that there would be something missing. Like when two people are falling in love, they know if they've kissed each other, they know if they've had sex, they know if they've said I love you. Like all these milestones loom very large to the people, and this is a story that's told in the first person. So I feel like a person could like like you could sort of debate whether writing a novel like this is a good idea. But if you're going to write a novel like this, I mean, of course you have to include like the kissing and everything else. So I feel like it has a really important role. I mean, I'm not I still can be embarrassed, or like I can be the person who wrote that book and feels like almost like technically I think that scene worked out really well, and then I someone could read a sentence to me from a scene that I wrote, and I could think like, oh my God, you know, like, like, so I don't know. So I feel like I'm sort of, do you feel like you have an answer to that? Like, are you, like, do you blush at your own sex scenes that you've written, or do you feel like I'm totally comfortable with these?
Oh, I'm totally comfortable with them. I don't blush because I'm actually shy in real life. And so it's very easy for me to be not shy on the page because it's not me. It's not real. Like I actually never, ever, ever write, let me not say that. I rarely write about my own romantic life because you got to have something for yourself. But in terms of fiction, I have no problem because it's not real and it's not me. And so, like, my characters, they want to get a little freaky, no problem. And I just lean into it. It's all good. Like, people have sex, like you said. Like, Bill and Hillary know, like, the sex they had. They know when they kissed, and, like, you know, when they first start having sex, she's like, the first 2 times was the first night, and the next 2 times was the next night. And you know, I think for that time, that was actually realistic. Sex was a little different. It was like the beginning of the 70s, 60s, 70s, sort of like, hey, you can have sex premaritally and the world won't come to an end. But it was also, there were some mores in place. And so that she was sort of keeping track, and that her previous sexual experiences were fairly lackluster. And like, finally someone had really, you know, nailed her properly. That, like, yeah, was interesting. So just a couple more questions before we let you go. And I think that this is interesting, and it's something I was thinking about while reading the book. And it kind of connects to the sex. Hillary was very aware in the book of her physical appearance. And there were a lot of references throughout to her body, to her hair, to her looks. Was that deliberate, or was that just something that kind of you noticed after the fact?
I think, well, I think that I would say it's pretty deliberate. I mean, again, this is like, well, I guess it's not a spoiler at this point, but she goes into politics. And I do think that, you know, women and their appearances when they run for public office are just like, it's like this completely different standard and topic of discussion and than men, like, you know, their hair, their makeup, their clothing, like who made their clothes. And so I do think that it's sort of, it's almost like, and she talks about the, Hillary herself talks about, I think it's often referred to as like the pink tax, that women candidates spend like usually, I think on average, an hour a day that men don't spend kind of preparing themselves. And if they don't, then people say, oh, is she sick, or is she, you know, like, is she exhausted or something? So in that way, I felt like, you know, the sort of like navigating public expectations seemed like it was, you know, relevant to the plot. But then there's also, so the New York Times journalist I mentioned, Amy Chozick, talks about how, like, what she says is she doesn't think that Bill is actually more attractive than Hillary, but she thinks it's very telling that Hillary thinks so, and you know, has essentially always conveyed that. And so I do think that, you know, it's sort of a very common stereotype that, like, you know, women can be smart or pretty, and that there's, you know, like, there's this idea that they can't or shouldn't be both, which obviously is like totally ludicrous, but it's such a common way of, like, you know, people seeing girls or women, that I think that is something that she grapples with in the book. But I also should say, as like one final note, I mean, I did not have access to like anything sort of secret about Hillary. So I don't really know. I mean, like, what I know is from books like Amy Chozick's or Carl Bernstein's. It's not like I do not know what her own sort of self-esteem is.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So my last question is just a question I love to ask all writers that I am in conversation with or that I interview. What do you like most about your writing?
That's such a lovely question. I've never been asked that.
Oh, good. That makes me happy.
Um, what do I like most? That's so God. It's like I almost can't think of how to answer. Okay, I think that this is what I would say. I think that it is like sort of easy or pleasurable to read, just in terms of like it like goes down easily or whatever, but no, we've made it this far.
I'm 14. I am absolutely 14. Go on.
You're delightful. I think that it is written smoothly, but it does not insult the reader's intelligence. So it's like a, I think that I always respect my reader's intelligence, but like am not pretentious.
Yeah.
How's that?
That's really good. And I agree with that estimation of your work. It does go down easy, but it's not facile writing, which is always a great combination where there's some substance there, but it's also pleasant to read. Curtis Sittenfeld, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you, not only about Rodham, but about your work more broadly. And best of luck with the rest of your virtual book tour.
Thank you, Roxane Gay. Thank you. This has been such a pleasure. Like, thank you for all the wonderful writerly questions. And if I can ever return the favor, it would be an honor. Thank you so much. This was super fun. Thank you. And I love your bookshelves.
Thank you. I'm very proud of them.
You should be. Okay. All right. Take care.
You too.
I think vlog. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Roxane.
Thank you.